Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Wednesday evening midweek study. Welcome, everybody, online as well. So this is our fourth lesson on Judges, and we are coinciding with Judges chapter 4. So we'll be looking at Judges chapter 4 and 5 tonight. I'm sure you've all read it in detail in preparation, and all probably know a lot more than I do, but if not, we shall push on nevertheless. So this is, again, one of the more well-known judges, I imagine. This of Deborah and the sort of captain of the army, Barak, that was her co-leader in some ways. And so chapter 4, we have kind of a narrative description of the sort of key elements of Deborah and Barak and their leadership. And then chapter 5, we actually have the recording of a song or a psalm, a hymn of victory, celebrating God and God's benevolence, and then getting into the specifics of Deborah and Barak's victory over the contemporary enemy or oppressor of the time. And so we'll just spend, again, this sort of next half hour or so looking at some of the details, and then we'll close off and then leave up some questions and discussion time. So Judges chapter 4 and verse 1 starts with, I imagine, what's a pretty familiar theme by this time, hopefully. So we've really emphasized and rammed home the point in Judges that there's this cyclical nature. That they get these opportunities to start afresh, but then they revert back. And this is a generational thing. And so last week we studied basically two judges, that of Othniel and Ehud. And Ehud was the second of those judges, and he was the assassin that went in and stabbed to the hilt the obese king and was able to escape away. And then we learn in chapter 1 of verse 4 that when Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Harosheth Hagoyim. And so the cycle continues. You'll probably get sick of me emphasizing it, but it really is, I think, necessary to appreciate sort of the frequency of this and the ease in which it continued to occur. And again, I think one of the strong points that we need to take away from the book of Judges is the danger of how easy this is. This isn't like 300 years in between times, and all the way in between they were faithful. This is only, periods of 20 years, 40 years that they are sort of having peace and prosperity and able to be in the ascendancy in the region. And then they go again, turn to the Ashtaroths, turn to these other gods, the fertility gods, the Baal worship, all of the pagan worship around about, intermarrying, all these things that we've emphasized. So they're at it again, and therefore God allows them to be punished. It says they're sold into the hand. And so, again, this isn't quite the same as the in the period of the kings, where the Assyrian army and then later on the Babylonian army come in and sort of ransack the land and take away, the people literally kind of manacled and as sort of, slave labor or servant labor, and, back to Babylon, Daniel, these sorts of things. This is a bit more like, well, we're the boss now, and, you pay us tribute, you do what we say, but they're sort of still in the land, is my understanding. And so, again, this cycle continues in verse 3. The children of Israel cry out to the Lord. And we saw this intimated a little bit in the first couple chapters. So in Judges chapter 4 and verse 3, that Jabin, he had 900 chariots of iron. For 20 years, he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel. And so, again, warfare is an ascendancy between nations or between tribes is often a function of technology. World War II ended pretty quickly once the United States demonstrated that they could wipe out a couple 100,000 people with one bomb dropped from one plane. You don't choose to keep fighting in that kind of environment. In the time that we're talking about here, 900 iron chariots tends to win most battles. You tend to not be able to fight that kind of a warfare if you've only got bow and arrows and spears and sort of a foot army. And so remember too that this is sort of in a conventional warfare sense. The people knew that they had God on their side. The people knew their history. The people knew that God could use the sea to swallow up the Egyptian army, that God could overcome, that in previous times they had overcome similar odds. And so again, this is a failing of faith and not just a failure of their sort of iron workers and their military leaders and these sorts of things. And so this is where we're introduced to Deborah. In chapter 4 and verse 4, we're told that she was a prophetess, a wife, and that she was judging Israel at the time. So again, an unusual feature in that we have a female leader here. Certainly much of the leadership prior to this in Israel and also post this, we would see were occupied by men. It doesn't say specifically why that is the case. Maybe she was, particularly faithful and God was rewarding her for this. Again, God doesn't always choose the most obvious character. We see this again and again. We see it in the New Testament with the likes of, Paul, the great persecutor of the church, being chosen. We see, a bit later on in Judges, Gideon being very reluctant about wanting to be, the leader and needing to be really convinced. We see Jesse's sons, and David wasn't even there in the initial kind of selection phase, and yet he was the one that was chosen to succeed Saul. So, leadership and the ways in which God works at times or is able to work his things isn't always with the strongest, brightest, mightiest, most obvious sort of character. From all we see from Deborah in the account here, she's a woman of courage, she's a woman of great faith, and that was clearly enough for God to appoint her both the prophetess and a judge. Though she's the only female judge, she's not the only female prophet that we have in the Bible. We see other female prophets, Miriam, Huldah, Noadiah in the New Testament, Anna we see in the temple in Jesus' kind of birth and early years. And so, again, we understand that there are patterns of worship and patterns of leadership in the church, and kind of gendered roles in that. But it's important to recognize that, and I think throughout history, some of that has been a reason series have been abused, and God has condemned the abuse. People like Tamar, lots of examples. And so, again, God doesn't. It's important for us not to extrapolate from the roles in which God has given men and women, and the natural biological strength that tends to occupy more in the male rather than the female. We can't at all extrapolate that and talk about inferior and superior and behave in such a ways. God says quite the opposite, that men are to treat women as the most precious thing in their life, like a precious vase, and all of these sorts of examples. So again, I don't want to spend the whole study just on that, but it is notable that Deborah here is female. It was unique among the judges of the record that we have, and unusual among leadership, but certainly reflective of the character of Deborah. And so we're told in verse 5, sit under a palm tree, and the children of Israel would come up to her for judgment. It's a really nice scene. I don't know, I'm sure Aaron has experiences of going to the district court and things like that. I don't think that they go and sit under a tree in Queen's Park and exercise judgment. Aaron's saying no. They sort of tend to be different environments. But it's I don't know, it's kind of a nice, almost a pastoral scene there. A bit reminiscent of Jesus. We see most of his teaching occurring outdoors and people coming up to him. And so in verse 6 here, she calls for Barak. So remember, she's a prophetess as well as a judge, so she is able to convey the teachings of God. Oftentimes we think of prophets as foretelling, telling of the future, but as much, if not more, they were forthtelling. They were talking about the present. They were delivering God's message about the immediate context. And I guess because we focus on Christ and those things, we look back and we look at the prophecies of Isaiah and others and see Christ in those. But Isaiah just as commonly was condemning and warning and teaching his present generation, as was Jeremiah, as was so many of the prophets. And so prior to, again, the sort of completeness of Scripture that we have, we would see prophets being ordained by God for these messages to particular audiences. And so it was time here. The children of Israel had called to God. God had clearly determined that they had learnt their lesson through the suffering of Jabin and Sisera. And so she calls for Barak. And she says to him, has not the Lord of God of Israel commanded, this is verse 6, go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and Zebulun, and against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. So she poses this as a question, and basically this message is known. It should be known to Barak. And verse 8 is fantastic. This is the real strong comparison between, and this kind of, I think, indicates why Barak hasn't taken his 10,000 army up yet. He says, I'll go if you go, but if you aren't going to go, I'm not going to go. It's sort of reminiscent of, like kids before an abandoned warehouse or something like that, or, I'll go in there if you'll go in there, kind of egging each other on and sort of, one trying to find the courage to go. And again, slightly different circumstances here. But clearly, Barak is reticent. Barak is thinking more of the 900 chariots than he is of God's power. Just like, remember the 12 spies that go into Canaan? 10 were thinking, these guys are huge. There's no way we can take these guys. And yet, the 2 spies who return say, look, it's a land flowing, milk and honey, and grapes, all this stuff. And God had promised it. And so, again and again and again, we see where people are focused on the immediate, where people can't see, think of Israel coming out of Egypt. And not long gone, they'd seen the 10 plagues. They'd seen the demonstration that God had provided. And yet they were barely away. And they were again worried. They were again wanting to go back. At least we had food. At least we had leek. Yeah, we were under the thumb. Yeah, it was a very difficult life in Egypt. But what are we going to do? Die out here? Again, completely ignoring God's beneficence and God's care and the fact that God had brought them thus far and would continue. And so remember what faith is. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So Barak was given victory, although he hadn't seen it yet. And so all he could see, he was focusing on what he could see, on the chariots, on these things. And how often do I fail in my faith because of my lack of conviction, my lack of assurance, my worry at the things that are going wrong, these sorts of things, rather than actually focusing on what God has told me and what God will honor in terms of being a father, in terms of being the Almighty, the all-knowing, all of these sorts of things. And so we have these comparisons here. And Deborah rams this home in verse 9. She says, I'll go with you, surely. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So, again, there is this sort of gendered idea. There is this idea, you got beaten by a woman. Clearly that's kind of underlying here, as it does throughout all communities. I'm sure you can see it in the grade 1 playground, this sort of idea. And so, Barak cops a scolding, and he's sort of, shamed somewhat because of his lack of courage, lack of faith. And so it comes to pass that Barak leads them up with Deborah, and so they go up. And then verse 11, we're introduced to this fellow Habar the Kenite, and he's was a descendant of Moses, basically, and he had actually made an alliance with the Canaanites, with the enemy, with Sisera and Jabin. And so it comes to the battle here, and so verse 13, Sisera gathers together all his chariots. Remember, he's in the ascendancy, he's dominant, he's beaten them, he's lived in with Israel under their thumb for the last 20 years, and so here's another battle, them coming up again. I'm sure he's expecting victory. And then verse 14 is a wonderful verse. I think, again, if you want to take something sort of into the week here, just the calm assurance that she brings. I think this is why Barak wants Deborah by his side. She has such certainty, and again, to what degree this is sort of God speaking through her, and to what degree is this her trusting in God. Clearly all of these things intersect, and I'm not going to say it's a certain percentage of one or the other. Clearly she's faithful to God, and clearly God uses her to deliver the people. And so she says, up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has the Lord not gone out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword. And Sisera flees away on foot, so doesn't die with his men, but not one soldier of the Canaanites are left alive. And then the rest of the chapter is devoted to Sisera fleeing. And again, it's I suspect a pretty well-known ending for Sisera because of its grisly nature. And so he seeks shelter back with the family of Heber the Kenite here, and there's a lady there, Jael. And so she's, it would seem, even though her immediate sort of family members had turned towards the Canaanites, that she still had faith and trust in God. And it would seem like she's going against, her household, in that she allows Sisera in, she deceives him, she gives him some milk when he's thirsty, she lays him down, and then she drives a tent peg into his skull, into his temple, and kills him quite violently, quite demonstratively. And so remember, this is the leader, the general. He's named here, so clearly a significant leader, the captain of the king's army here, and he's put to death along with all of his army because of the deliverance, first and foremost, of God, but through clearly the assurances and the declarative nature of Deborah. And so we see here just some of the characteristics of Deborah. So she's, we don't, with a number of these judges, we're kind of just given, the bare bones or the moment where they sort of show their leadership and show their significance. We don't have a lot of that back history, apart from the fact that she's a homemaker. She's called in chapter 5, verse 7, a mother in Israel. So again, we'd assume that she has children to Lapidoth. We've sort of covered a lot of that there, but it's important to recognize, I think, the characteristics or the observations that we can make about this lady from what we know. So we can see that she listened to God. We can see that she knew that there was this message here, not just hearing but listening, in that important distinction that the Bible makes again and again. It would seem that Barak likewise had probably heard or knew what God had said. Perhaps, Deborah had relayed this message before, and Barak's, convictions had failed him. But nevertheless, she listened and was certain that God would provide them victory. She had this servant's heart. She was willing to delegate tasks, and she offered praise to God. She led with authority. I think that's one of the really great characteristics we see here, is that is her authority, her willingness to not worry about the 900 iron chariots, not worry about the 20 years of oppression, but actually focus more on God and focus more on what God could do, and knowing that nothing could stand in that way. And so she was able to motivate the people and really be a respected leader. Clearly you can see that just in those couple of verses there, that Barak says, if you come, I'll follow. So it's clearly here, she clearly conveys this sense of authority, this sense of conviction that Barak himself was unable to summon without her presence. And so, she goes to the battlefront, and all battlefronts have their risks, the theatre of war. And so she doesn't just say, oh, look, it's my job to stay here and judge, your Barak, you're supposed to go and lead the people. She says, okay, well, I'll go, and, I'm going to get the praise for it. You're not going to get, the praise for this victory. And so I think, there's a lot there that can be, that I can learn from, I think, in terms of courage, in terms of trusting in the word of the Lord. So what's really nice here is this chapter 5 as well. So again, Judges isn't just sort of dry history and depictions of battle and people being put to death in ugly manners. So chapter 5 here, we have Deborah and Barak singing a song. It says, they sang on that day. I'm not going to sing it for you. I can assure you that I'll say that I don't know the tune, but even if I did, I wouldn't be singing it for you. But I think it's useful. I'm just going to read through it, and then we'll just make a couple of notes here before we finish up, because Deborah had this confidence, we've talked about. The outcome was favorable to them. Again, it was God doing these things, just as it was God felling the walls of Jericho. There wasn't anything inherently destructive about marching around and then blowing the trumpets. It was an exercise in faith. There wasn't anything inherently. Israel wasn't blessed with lots of civil engineers who were able to separate the waters and then bring them back in. All of these things are acts of God instilling faith in the people. And what is remarkable is how quickly they continue to lose their faith, even though they have these great national events, and built into them is memorial feasts and memorial celebrations and they were supposed to remember these things. And yet we see they continue to struggle to do that. And so Deborah not only is able to, again, trust in God, lead with confidence, be victorious, but then she's thankful for it. She's able to give the due praise where it is due. And again, I think, how often do we collectively, pray for certain circumstances, the old no atheists in foxholes, pray and turn to God where things get down. But then when things turn for the better, when things are improving, how often, am I the same fervent in prayer, in praise, and in thanksgiving, and in honoring God? Or, do I want to take credit for these things, or do I want to, again, we understand. The point is that we need to be full of thanks and humility and gratitude as much as we need to be full of courage and faith and certainty in God. And so she sings, or they sing, Barak as well, when leaders lead in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. I, even I, will sing to the Lord. I will sing praise to the Lord God of Israel. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens poured. The clouds also poured water. The mountains gushed before the Lord. This Sinai before the Lord God of Israel. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, and the travelers walked along the byways. Village life ceased. It ceased in Israel, until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. They chose new gods, small g. Then there was war in the gates. Not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with the rulers of Israel, who offered themselves willingly with the people. Bless the Lord. Speak, you who ride on white donkeys, who sit in judges' attire, and who walk along the road, far from the noise of the archers, among the watering places. There they shall recount the righteous acts of the Lord, the righteous acts for his villages in Israel. Then the people of the Lord shall go down to the gates. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, sing a song. Arise, Barak, and lead your captives away, O son of Abinoam. Then the survivors came down, the people against the nobles. The Lord came down for me against the mighty. From Ephraim were those whose roots were in Amalek. After you, Benjamin, with your peoples. From Machir, rulers came down. And from Zebulun, those who bear the recruiter's staff. And the princes of Issachar were with Deborah. As Issachar, so was Barak, sent into the valley under his command. Among the divisions of Reuben, there were great resolves of heart. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the pipings of the flocks? The divisions of Reuben have great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. And why did Dan remain on ships? Asher continued at the seashore and stayed by his inlets. Zebulun is a people who jeopardize their lives to the point of death. Naphtali also, on the heights of the battlefield. The kings came and fought. Then the kings of Canaan fought in Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They took no spoils of silver. They fought from the heavens. The stars from their courses fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. That ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. O my soul, march on in strength. Then the horses' hooves pounded, the galloping of his steeds. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord. Curse it, its inhabitants bitterly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, to the help of the Lord against the mighty. Most blessed among women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Blessed is she among women in tents. He asked for water. She gave milk. She brought out cream in a lordly bowl. She stretched her hand to the tent peg, her right hand to the workman's hammer. She pounded Sisera. She pierced his head. She split and struck through his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell, he lay still. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. The widow of Sisera looked through the window and cried out through the lattice, "Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarries the clatter of his chariots?" Her wisest ladies answered her. Yes, she answered herself. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil, to every man a girl or two? For Sisera, plunderer of dyed garments, plunder of garments embroidered and dyed, 2 pieces of dyed embroidery for the neck of the looter. Thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the sun when it comes out in full strength. So the land had rest for 40 years. Probably need an MA rating on that song or something, particularly the JL section. But we see there that in verse 2 we have the purpose, and then verse 3 the call of witnesses. Verses 4 and 5, God's past deliverances. And then verses 6 to 9, we have the oppression in Israel before God's deliverance. And then verses 10 to 11, an accounting of God's righteous acts. Verse 12 is Deborah's call. Verse 13 to 18, a remembrance of the response of the tribes of Israel. Verses 19 to 23, the battle. And then verses 24 to 27, Jael's triumph. Verses 28 to 30, almost this mocking of Sisera's mother, her anxiety at her warrior son not coming home. And then verse 31, the conclusion. So, again, I think it's just sort of really fascinating, this song that kind of captures the narrative history of the previous verse. You can see that it's sort of different language, that there's some rhyming, some repetition in there. There's this sort of mocking, this imagined character of Sisera's mother, and all of these sorts of things. And so clearly a demonstration of Deborah's courage and faith, and how this translated into the army that was able to overcome the oppressor of the day, and then to bring peace onto the land. We'll see in chapter 6 and verse 1, moving into next week, the cycle returns, but nevertheless, we'll move on into Gideon next week. We'll leave up on the slides some discussion questions for those online, and for those here, we'll participate in that discussion. But really, just questions around these 2 characters of Deborah and Barak, and clearly one with more courage, and how in our own life that there might be times where we are in the position of Deborah, where people are looking to us, and we might be in the position of Barak, where we're looking to others, and how those dynamics kind of work out in our own life. So thanks very much for joining all those online, and thanks very much to those